He was the founding heartbeat of the Rolling Stones, the man who named the band and gave it its swagger, yet he died before he saw 30. The world was told he drowned in his own swimming pool, but the court that cleared his name also buried the truth. How does a man survive the wildest years of rock and roll, only to be found at the bottom of the water on a quiet summer night, with a verdict that pleased everyone except the dead? The arrest itself was a performance of sorts, a carefully staged raid on a London flat that yielded nothing more incriminating than a small amount of cannabis, a substance as common in the mid-60s as tea leaves. The police, however, arrived with the theatrical urgency of a drug bust on a Hollywood backlot, their presence timed to coincide with the Sunday tabloids' press deadlines. This was not justice. It was a public spectacle designed to break a man the establishment had come to see as a threat, and the evidence, such as it was, seemed almost incidental to the predetermined outcome. The real crime, it seemed, was not the possession of a few grams of marijuana, but the very act of being Brian Jones, the golden-haired founder of the Rolling Stones. The press, ever eager for a fallen idol, fanned the flames with a relentless campaign of character assassination, painting Jones not as a young man in trouble, but as a corrupting influence on the youth of Britain. Headlines screamed of his decadence and his dangerous lifestyle long before any verdict was reached, ensuring that the court of public opinion had already found him guilty. In this atmosphere of manufactured hysteria, the legal system proved to be a willing accomplice, and the subsequent trial at West London Magistrates' Court was a mere formality. The judge, in a ruling that reeked of moral panic, sentenced Jones to 9 months in prison for the offence, a punishment that was startlingly disproportionate to the crime. The medical testimony, which should have been a cornerstone of the defence, was callously disregarded, a detail that speaks volumes about the heir's ignorance and the systemic cruelty aimed at him. Jones had been told by his own doctors that prison would be catastrophic for his mental and physical health, a fragile constitution already buckling under the weight of his fame and the pressure of his bandmates' ambitions. He was a man being punished not for his actions, but for his very existence, a scapegoat for a society terrified of the counterculture he helped to popularise. The prison sentence was eventually overturned on appeal, but the damage had been done, the verdict having already served its purpose in the public's eye. The legal victory was hollow, a technicality that did little to repair the reputation that had been so thoroughly shredded by the tabloids and the courts. He was released on bail within a day, but the stain of the conviction clung to him, a permanent scar that would define his final years and isolate him from the very movement he had helped create. Did the authorities ever understand that they were not punishing a drug user, but systematically dismantling a founding member of the greatest rock and roll band in the world? The message was clear. He was now a criminal, deemed undesirable, and his subsequent visa was revoked, a final cruel twist that would set the stage for his total isolation from his band and his eventual, mysterious demise. The rejection had begun long before the official announcement, a slow and quiet erosion that was almost harder to bear than a sudden blow. By 1968, Brian Jones was already a ghost inside the band he had named, his once central presence fading as the others moved into a future that no longer seemed to include him. He would arrive at the studio, his fingers swollen and clumsy from the drugs and the drink, and watch as Keith Richards took command of the guitar parts that used to be his territory. The sessions became a ritual of humiliation, where his contributions were politely waved away or simply erased from the final mix, and the others had stopped pretending that his opinion mattered. Was there a single moment when he understood that he had become a passenger in his own creation? The rehearsals grew shorter, the excuses grew thinner, and the distance between him and the rest of them became a canyon that no amount of old friendship could bridge. Their manager, Andrew Loog Oldham, had seen the end coming with a clarity that bordered on prophecy, and he did not bother to soften the verdict when he delivered it. He told Jones, in terms that left no room for comfort, that the band would not last another 6 months if he remained in it, and that his presence had become a liability they could no longer afford to carry. The words were cruel, but they carried the weight of a man who understood that sentiment had no place in the machinery of rock and roll. Jones listened, his face unreadable, and perhaps he knew that Oldham was only saying aloud what the others had been whispering behind his back for months. The prophecy hung in the air like a verdict, and the strange thing was that it was not about his playing or his songwriting anymore, but about his very existence as a problem to be solved. What do you do with the founder of a band when he becomes the obstacle to its survival? The final blow came in June of 1969, when Mick Jagger and Keith Richards drove out to his house in the countryside to deliver the news personally, a courtesy that felt more like an execution. They told him that the band had decided to move on without him, that his lifestyle had made it impossible for them to continue, and that they had already found a replacement in a young guitarist named Mick Taylor. Jones reportedly stared at them in silence, the words sinking in slowly, and then he simply asked them to confirm what he already knew in his heart. He was out, not because he had stopped being talented, but because he had become inconvenient, a loose thread that needed to be cut for the tapestry to hold. The band announced his departure in a press release that praised his talent while making it clear that his departure was a relief, and the world understood what had really happened. A week later, he was found dead at the bottom of his swimming pool, and the questions that followed were never truly answered. The band played on without him, a new chapter beginning, but the shadow of that June afternoon followed them for the rest of their lives. The system's treatment of Brian Jones stands in stark contrast to the leniency shown to his bandmates just weeks earlier. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards faced the same drug charges, yet their appeals succeeded, their sentences were overturned, and they walked free within days. Jones received no such mercy, no legal sympathy, and no second chance from a system that seemed determined to break him. How could two men escape the same legal storm while the third was left to drown? The answer lies not in the weight of evidence, but in the weight of public opinion, carefully manufactured by the very newspapers that had once celebrated the Stones' bad boy image. Jagger and Richards had their sentences quashed on appeal, a legal outcome that suggested the original prosecutions were always more about public theatre than justice. Yet Jones bore the full punishment alone. Even the folk singer Donovan, arrested in the same period on similar charges, saw his case handled with a fraction of the venom directed at Jones. The difference was not the crime but the target. Jones was the vulnerable one, the sensitive soul, the man whose health was crumbling, and the establishment smelled blood in the water. When you study a case like this, you must first separate the legal facts from the media narrative, because the newspapers of 1967 were not reporting a crime but crafting a character assassination. The second step is to compare outcomes across similar cases, not just the verdicts but the treatment, the bail conditions, the public statements, and the willingness of authorities to show mercy. Do that comparison here and the pattern becomes unmistakable. Jones was not convicted because he was guilty. He was convicted because he was expendable, a truth that his own band would soon demonstrate with devastating clarity. The rain had stopped by the time she found him, but the water still stood in glassy sheets across the lawn. Anna Wolin, his partner, would later describe a night that refused to make sense, a night that began with wine and ended with a body lying face down in the deep end of the pool at Cotchford Farm. She had heard no splash, no cry, no struggle, only the terrible silence of an English summer night in July 1969, broken by a single unaccountable cough, when she and the builder finally pulled him from the water. His lips were blue and his hands were clenched, and the clock had stopped at a moment no one could properly explain. The police arrived with their notebooks and their certainties, and they found the scene remarkably easy to read. A man with a known fondness for drink and pills, a pool, a dark night, and the obvious conclusion that he had simply drowned. But the details refused to cooperate with the official version, and the gaps in the record would haunt every later investigation. The pathologist noted that Brian Jones had an enlarged heart, that his liver was severely damaged, and that his blood contained both alcohol and barbiturates, yet none of this explained the bruises on his forearm, the fresh wound on his scalp, or the fact that his lungs contained far less water than a drowning man's should have held. The coroner recorded death by misadventure, a verdict that sounded neat but explained nothing at all. A critical piece of evidence would not surface until decades later, when the original toxicology report was finally examined in full and found to contain a detail that had been quietly omitted from every public account of the inquest. The level of barbiturates in his system was so high that it would have rendered him effectively unconscious within 20 minutes of ingestion, a finding that sat in direct contradiction with the claim that he had been swimming or even walking unassisted. The report documented roughly 3 milligrams of amylobarbital, a dose that an expert would later tell the BBC was simply incompatible with the story of an accidental stumble into the water. so the question buries itself deeper with every re-examination. If he could barely stand, how did he reach the pool, and why did no one hear anything at all? The case was reopened in 1994 by the Sussex police, and the files were pulled from the archive and dusted off with all the solemnity of a cold case finally taken seriously. They interviewed witnesses again, they re-ran the science, and they concluded, with a bureaucratic shrug, that there was insufficient evidence to challenge the original verdict. But the most uncomfortable detail emerged from the testimony of the builder who had been staying at the house, the same man who had helped pull the body from the water, and who would later admit that he had concealed parts of that evening for more than 40 years. He told a journalist in 2009 that the arrangement of the body, the position of the arms, and the strange absence of any water in the lungs suggested something far more deliberate than misadventure, and that he had been pressured to keep quiet. So you sit with the fragments, and you try to build a picture that holds together, and it always falls apart at the same seam. The girlfriend who heard a cough and nothing else, the builder who waited before raising the alarm, the police who never questioned the obvious, the toxicology report that was quietly edited, the pathologist who noted injuries consistent with a struggle, and then ruled them all irrelevant. Every official answer generates 3 unofficial questions, and the name that surfaces in nearly every whisper is the same name that had been carved into his gravestone after a memorial service that none of his bandmates attended. He was 27 years old. He had been dead for less than a week, and the mystery had already begun to harden into something the public would never quite agree on. The silence around his coffin was louder than any tribute. When they lowered Brian Jones into the ground at Hathersage on a grey July afternoon in 1969, the 3 surviving Rolling Stones were conspicuously absent, a decision that spoke volumes and echoed for decades. Mick Jagger stood at the graveside, his expression unreadable behind dark glasses, but the other band members chose distance over duty, a public statement of the rift that had defined their final years together. The man who had named the band, who had fought for its very existence, was dispatched with a quiet ceremony that felt less like a farewell and more like a closing of accounts. Keith Richards would later offer a confession that cut through the years of silence with brutal honesty. In his autobiography, he admitted that they had treated Jones terribly, acknowledging the cruelty with a frankness that Jagger never managed. The words arrived decades too late to mend anything, yet they confirmed what fans had long suspected. The expulsion in June 1969 was not a sudden decision, but the culmination of a slow, painful estrangement. By the time Jones was asked to leave the group he had founded, he was already a ghost in their midst, present in name only, his contributions diminishing as his demons multiplied. What the band failed to acknowledge publicly, the music itself never forgot. Jones had been the restless architect of the Stones' early sound, the multi-instrumentalist who could pick up a sitar, a marimba, or a dulcimer and weave it into the fabric of a song with instinctive grace. His fingerprints are all over classics like Paint It Black and Ruby Tuesday, tracks that showcased his willingness to experiment when the others were content to follow blues conventions. The tragedy is that his finest work came precisely when the band was beginning to ease him out of the creative process, a bitter irony that haunts every listen to Aftermath or Between the Buttons. Did they ever understand what they lost when they cut him loose? The question hangs over every retrospective of those years, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Jones spent his final months at Cotchford Farm, the Sussex cottage once owned by Winnie the Pooh author A.A. Milne, trying to reinvent himself while the machine he had built rolled on without him. Friends who visited in those last weeks described a man attempting to reclaim his footing, planning new projects, speaking of the future with a fragile optimism that made the sudden darkness of July 3rd all the more cruel. The sad truth is that the band's grief, when it finally surfaced, was tangled with relief, an emotion no one dared voice at the time. Jagger's decision to perform in Hyde Park just 2 days after the funeral, dedicating the show to Jones's memory, was read by some as tribute and by others as expedience. The footage shows a crowd of thousands, flowers scattered by helicopter, a moment of collective mourning that felt manufactured yet somehow sincere. It was the last time the Stones would publicly honour their founder, and even that gesture carried the weight of unresolved guilt. What remains undeniable is the music Jones left behind, a catalogue that outlasts every feud and every bitter word. His slide guitar on No Expectations, recorded just weeks before his death, carries a melancholy that seems almost prophetic, a farewell disguised as a country blues. Contemporary musicians who never saw him play still cite him as an influence, proof that his restless spirit found its expression in the grooves of vinyl rather than the headlines of scandal sheets. The archives have since been ransacked for unreleased material, each demo and alternate take offering a glimpse of what might have been had the band held him closer. The denial that followed his death became its own kind of legacy, a pattern of avoidance that prevented any real reconciliation during the years when it might have mattered. Richards's admission came in 2010, over 40 years after the drowning that ended Jones's life, and even then it was qualified by the caveat that everyone was young and foolish, and none of them knew any better. Perhaps that is the cruelest twist. The men who outlived him could afford the luxury of reflection, while the founder of the greatest rock and roll band in the world was frozen forever at 27, his flaws and gifts sealed in amber. Half a century after his body was lifted from a swimming pool, Brian Jones still refuses to sit still in his grave. Polls and comment sections remain split in a way that feels almost personal. Some fans swearing he was murdered by an electrician with a grudge, others insisting he drowned because his own body simply gave up, and a 2005 survey by The Guardian found that nearly a third of respondents still believed he was killed. Why does a death from 1969 cut so cleanly through the public? Because the story never got a clean ending, and human minds struggle to accept an unfinished sentence. The official verdict said death by misadventure, yet the file read like a draft full of crossed-out lines and missing pages, so people filled the blanks with their own conclusions. When you sit with that uncertainty, the real lesson is not about Brian Jones at all, but about how you and I consume a story that refuses to be tidy. The first step is to name the source of your discomfort, because most of the anger around this case comes from the feeling that something was taken away without permission. Ask yourself whether you are reacting to the evidence or to the silence, because silence is a vacuum that grief and suspicion will always rush into. The second step is to separate the man from the myth, and this is harder than it sounds, since the myth has been polished for decades by headlines that needed a villain or a victim. Brian Jones was a founder who got pushed out of his own band, a musician who lost his grip, and a person whose worst moments were played louder than his best ones. Look at what he actually left behind, the guitar lines and the arrangements that shaped the Rolling Stones before they became a stadium act, and then ask if that work deserves to be buried under the gossip. The third step is to hold two truths at once, that the official record is flawed, and that a flawed record is not proof of conspiracy. You can feel sympathy for a man who was isolated and unwell, and still accept that the coroner might have been wrong without being evil. What you cannot do is let a 50-year-old mystery distract you from the pattern, because the treatment of Brian Jones was not an accident of history, but a warning about how fame devours the ones who cannot keep up. The public split over his death speaks less about him and more about us, about our need for endings that make sense, our hunger for a villain to blame, our refusal to sit with the unbearable idea that sometimes a life just ends badly. So when you scroll past another thread arguing about whether he was killed, stop counting the likes and start counting the assumptions, because the loudest voices are rarely the ones holding the evidence. What would it change about your understanding if you accepted that the truth might be permanently out of reach, and that the most honest response is not certainty, but a quiet, patient attention to what remains? The court case was the injustice that buried him alive, and the mystery of his death was the lock on the coffin. Yet the music he left behind refuses to stay underground, shimmering through the decades with a strange, defiant tenderness. He was cast out by his own band, mocked by the press, and reduced to a footnote in his own story, all while his guitar work sketched the very blueprint for the psychedelic sound that defined an era. The question of what truly happened on that July night in 1969 remains a scar on history, a murmur that will not fade. But perhaps the truth is not a single fact, but a feeling. Listen to the textures he wove into those early Stones records, and you hear a man who was never lost, only dismissed. He gave rock and roll its colour and its shadow, and in return the world gave him a shallow grave. Was he a casualty of his own demons or a sacrifice laid upon the altar of fame? That answer died with him in the deep end of that pool, leaving us with only the music and the silence. The silence is the injustice, the music is the memory, and the question is yours to hold.